Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the single most important day in Texas history that most of America spent over 150 years pretending didn't happen. We're talking about Juneteenth, not the federal holiday, not the barbecue and the red soda, not the Hallmark version, the actual day, June 19th, 1865. The morning when somewhere around 250,000 people in the state of Texas woke up still enslaved and went to bed legally free. Except it wasn't that simple. It was never that simple. And the truth of what actually happened that day, who knew what and when, who tried to stop it, who lied about it, and what it actually felt like to finally hear those words out loud. That truth is messier and more painful and more extraordinary than anything a simple holiday can contain. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and whether you already knew the full story of Juneteenth before sitting down with me right now. The whole story. The uncomfortable parts, the parts about who knew and who lied, and what happened in the days and weeks after the soldiers rode back out. I have a feeling a lot of you are about to find out that the version you got in school left out most of the good parts and all of the honest ones. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put on something soft in the background. The low hum of a fan. Maybe the sound of wind through open windows, the way June sounds when the air is thick and the night is still and the heat hasn't quite decided to let go yet, even after sunset. Tonight, we're going somewhere real, somewhere that actually happened. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be told you were free after a lifetime of being told you were property? What does your body do with that information? What do your hands do? Your voice? Your legs? Do you run? Or do you stand completely still? Because your knees just won't cooperate and your chest feels like it might collapse from the weight of something you've been carrying so long you forgot there was any other way to stand. Have you ever wondered why Texas was the last to know, when the rest of the Confederacy had already crumbled and Lee had surrendered at Appomattox 2 full months before? Or why the news took 2.5 years to officially arrive, 2.5 years, in a state where the newspapers had been covering the Emancipation Proclamation in detail since 1862? What exactly was General Order Number 3, and why were the last few sentences of it almost as troubling as the first few were liberating? Who were the men and women standing in Galveston on that June morning? And what became of them when the soldiers packed up and moved on? And what does it mean that a people who had every conceivable reason to be broken and bitter instead chose, from the very first year, to celebrate? And kept choosing to celebrate over and over for 160 years, until the whole country finally, reluctantly, caught up. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Texas. The year is 1865. The month is June. The air already smells like heat and brine and the particular kind of dust that clings to a coastal plain that hasn't seen good rain in 2 weeks. The Gulf of Mexico is somewhere behind the morning haze, and the city of Galveston is coming awake around you, the way port cities always do. Noisily, commercially, with the sound of workers and carts and shouted negotiations drifting in from the Strand, the commercial district where the cotton bales are stacked and the shipping offices run their business of moving wealth around the world. You don't know yet what today is. Nobody does, in the way we know it now, looking back with 160 years of perspective. All you know is that something has been shifting. The war that has been grinding the country to dust for 4 years is apparently over, somewhere far away, and Union soldiers arrived at the harbor yesterday and something about the way they carry themselves, the way they move through the streets in uniform, the way they post their notices on walls, says that things are about to be different. Something in the air, something in the way your chest feels tighter than usual before you've even fully opened your eyes. You are one of roughly 250,000 people in the state of Texas who woke up this morning classified under law, under custom, and under the everyday practice of an entire civilization built around the premise as the property of another person, not a laborer, not a tenant, not even a servant in the way the word would be understood in other contexts. Property. You have been classified this way your entire life. Your mother was classified this way. Her mother before her was classified this way. You have been fed and housed and clothed at the discretion of someone who owned not just your labor, but your children, your body, your future, your right to learn to read, your right to marry, your right to be somewhere other than here. You have survived every morning of every year you've been alive by keeping your head down, your hands moving, your voice carefully calibrated to the registers of deference that keep you safe, and your dreams to yourself. The deep private dreams that you share only with the people you trust in the dark, in the hours between the end of one day's labor and the beginning of the next. Today, though you don't know it yet, is the last morning that is technically true. Here's the thing about Texas in the summer of 1865 that the textbooks tend to brush past in their rush to reach the tidy ending. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. That was 2 months before this morning. 2 full months. In those 2 months, the news of Confederate collapse had spread across most of the South. Formerly enslaved people in Virginia had known for weeks. In Georgia and the Carolinas and Mississippi, freedom was arriving, imperfect and dangerous and contested, surrounded by violence and black codes and all the mechanisms a dying system reaches for when it knows it's dying, but arriving nonetheless. The Emancipation Proclamation itself had taken effect on January 1st, 1863. 2 years and 5 months before this morning, in June 1865. By every legal and moral standard that existed, you had been a free person for 2 years and 5 months. The law said so. The President of the United States said so. The Union Army, wherever it went, said so. Texas said no, not loudly, not with a formal rebellion against the terms of emancipation. Texas said no with something quieter and more durable than any declaration, the simple, brutal act of not telling anyone. The Union Army had never seriously occupied Texas during the war. The geography, the sheer size of the state, the distance from the main theaters of battle, all of it had kept Texas insulated from the kind of sustained federal military presence that forced the physical reality of emancipation onto other Confederate states. No blue-coated soldiers patrolling your county meant no one to enforce the law. And if there was no one to enforce the law, some very powerful men in Texas decided, then the law didn't actually apply. At least not yet. At least not until it had to. Now here's where the story gets deliberately uncomfortable, because a myth has grown up around the Texas delay that makes it sound more innocent than it was. The myth says that Texas was simply too remote, too disconnected from the information networks of the Eastern Confederacy to have received the news of emancipation in any timely way. A messenger killed on the road, maybe. Poor communication in a pre-telegraph era. The fog of war, distance and circumstance. This myth is useful to certain people because it removes intention from the equation and replaces it with bad luck. The myth is false. Civil War historians have documented clearly that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had been covered extensively in Texas newspapers. Not buried, not downplayed, but reported. As early as 1862 and 1863. The people who enslaved others in Texas knew exactly what Lincoln had signed. They read about it. They discussed it in their legislatures and their county courthouses and their churches and over their dinner tables. They knew the war was lost months before Lee surrendered. They made a calculation. Keep extracting labor from people they legally no longer had the right to keep for as long as possible, because no one with sufficient force had yet arrived to stop them. And in the months leading up to June 1865, as the Confederacy fell apart state by state, something even more deliberately cynical was happening. Slaveholders from neighboring states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, had been moving into Texas specifically to outrun emancipation, bringing their enslaved people with them. If your plantation in Louisiana was being overrun by Union soldiers, if your workers were walking off the moment freedom was declared, Texas was your last option. Historians have estimated that more than 150,000 enslaved people were moved into Texas by this refugee wave of slaveholders in the final years and months of the Confederacy. Texas had become the last refuge of a dying system, a place to squeeze out one more season, one more harvest, one more year maybe, if you were lucky, and federal enforcement was slow. It was slow. And some men built careers on how slow it was. The Union Army arrived in Galveston Bay on June 18, 1865. 2,000 soldiers sailing in under the hot Gulf sky. Among them were elements of the 29th United States Colored Troops, black soldiers, men who had fought under the Union flag, who arrived in Galveston Harbor the very day before General Order No. 3 was issued, delayed by ship repairs, but present for the moment itself. Think about that for a moment. Among the men who came to enforce freedom in Texas were men who had themselves been denied it. Let that land. You are on the island of Galveston, and you are one of roughly 250,000 people in the state of Texas who woke up this morning classified, under law, under custom, and under the everyday practice of an entire civilization built around the premise as someone else's property. Not a laborer, not a worker, property, inventory, something to be listed in a will alongside the furniture and the livestock. You have been classified this way your entire life. Your mother was classified this way, her mother before her. Your children are classified this way. Any child you have, any child you might have, is classified this way from the moment of birth. The system is designed to be self-perpetuating. It feeds itself. And you have been feeding it with your body and your time and your skill and your children's bodies for as long as you have been alive. You have survived every morning of your life by keeping your head down and your hands moving and your voice in the registers of careful deference that keep you physically safe. You have survived by reading your enslaver the way you read weather, watching for the shifts that signal danger, learning the rhythms of mood and temper and appetite, developing an expertise in human psychology under conditions that required the expertise to be accurate, or the consequences were severe. You have survived by keeping your real self, your real opinions, your real rage, your real love, your real dreams, tucked somewhere inside where it is warm and private and cannot be taken from you. Not loudly, not with a formal declaration stating that Texas rejected the terms of emancipation. Texas said no with something quieter and more durable and more dishonest. The calculated, deliberate act of simply not telling anyone, of keeping the news contained, of continuing the business of slavery past the point when the law said it had ended. because the law is only as real as the force standing behind it, and the force hadn't arrived in Texas yet. The Union Army had never occupied the state's interior during the war. The geography, the sheer immensity of Texas, the distances involved, the state's position at the western edge of the Confederacy, far from the main campaigns, had kept it insulated from the kind of sustained Union military presence that made emancipation a practical reality elsewhere. No blue uniformed soldiers moving through your county meant no one to enforce the new law. And if no one was enforcing the law, some very powerful men in Texas had decided, then the law could wait. Now let's address the myth, because it matters. There is a persistent story about the Juneteenth delay that makes it sound like a matter of circumstance rather than choice. The story goes, Texas was remote, communications were poor. A messenger was reportedly killed on the road carrying the news from Washington. The fog of war and the vast distances of the American frontier conspired to keep 250,000 people in ignorance of their freedom for over 2 years. This story is comforting because it removes the word deliberate from the equation. It is also false. The Emancipation Proclamation had been covered in Texas newspapers, not buried, not coded, but reported in plain language. As early as 1862 and 1863, historians who have studied the period carefully have established this without ambiguity. The Texas press covered Lincoln's proclamation as news. The people who enslaved others in Texas read those newspapers. They knew what Lincoln had signed. They knew what it meant. They knew the war was lost. And they chose, with full knowledge of what the law required of them, to continue enslaving people anyway, because no one had yet arrived with sufficient force to make the cost of that choice exceed the benefit. This is not a story of ignorance. It's a story of deliberate defiance of a law that those in power had decided they could afford to defy for as long as the defiance was economically rational. Here's the part that should make your blood run cold. In the months after Appomattox, as the Confederacy was visibly collapsing state by state, a wave of slaveholders from neighboring states had been streaming into Texas specifically to outrun emancipation. If your plantation in Louisiana was being overrun by Union soldiers, if your workers were walking off the land the moment freedom was declared, Texas was your refuge. Texas was the last place the federal enforcement hadn't reached yet. Historians estimate that more than 150,000 enslaved people were moved into Texas by these refugee slaveholders in the final years and months of the war. 150,000 people deliberately transported across state lines and brought deeper into the Confederacy, specifically to keep them enslaved longer. Texas had become the last fortress of a dying system, and some men were still building walls inside it, even as the siege was already underway. The Union Army arrived at Galveston Bay on June 18, 1865. 2,000 federal soldiers sailing in under the Gulf sky. Among them were elements of the 29th United States Colored Troops, black soldiers who had enlisted in the Union Army, who had fought under the American flag, who had arrived in Galveston Harbor the very day before General Order No. 3 was issued, their ship having put in for repairs. They were present for the moment. Think about that for a moment and feel what it means. Among the men who came to deliver freedom to Texas were men who had until recently been denied it themselves. Men who had made the choice to fight for a country that hadn't yet decided to fully claim them. They were there, in uniform, on the docks of Galveston. With the main force came Major General Gordon Granger, the officer who had been assigned what would turn out to be the most historically significant assignment of his career. Granger was a West Point graduate, class of 1845, a career military man who had distinguished himself at the battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga. He was not an abolitionist. He was not a man burning with particular passion for the rights of those who had been enslaved. He was a competent officer who had been handed a legal duty and intended to execute it. He established headquarters at the Osterman Building, at the corner of 22nd and Strand in Galveston's commercial district. The following morning, June 19th, he issued General Order No. 3. Let me take a moment here for Galveston itself, because the setting matters. Galveston, in 1865, is not a frontier backwater. It is the largest city in Texas, a proper port city with layers of commercial and social life built up over decades. Cotton comes through here in enormous quantities. Galveston is one of the most important cotton ports in the entire Gulf of Mexico, and the Strand, the commercial street that runs parallel to the harbor, is lined with the offices and warehouses and mercantile establishments of men who have grown wealthy moving this crop. Ships from New Orleans, New York, Liverpool dock here regularly. There are hotels and banks and newspapers and churches and theaters. The city has the specific social complexity that port cities develop, when different kinds of people, different levels of wealth, different degrees of freedom and unfreedom, all have to navigate the same streets and the same economy. The streets are paved with oyster shells. White egrets stand at the water's edge in the mornings, unbothered by the city noise. The air smells like the Gulf and like commerce, and in June, like heat. Real heat, not the polite heat of places that have weather. Gulf Coast heat, personal and insistent, a physical presence from before sunrise to well after dark. Galveston also has a black community with its own depth and history. Free black residents have lived on this island alongside enslaved ones for decades, navigating the strange and constrained world of pre-war Gulf Coast society, where freedom was always conditional, always qualified, always subject to revocation if you pushed too hard in the wrong direction. And most importantly, there is Reedy Chapel AME Church, established on this island in 1848. For 17 years, this church has been the center of black communal and spiritual life in Galveston, a place of worship and mutual aid, and the cautious, persistent cultivation of community in conditions that worked against community at every turn. On June 19, 1865, the order will be read at Reedy Chapel as the last stop on the soldiers' march through the city. Freedom's first day ends at the oldest black church on the island. The order itself is not long. It reads, in its essential passage, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor." Absolute equality of personal rights. Those 4 words. If you have spent your entire life being told you have no rights, that your personhood is contingent, revocable, subordinate, owned, those 4 words are the size of a universe. And in 1865, most of the people hearing them are not reading them. They are hearing them spoken. Because in a state where it had been illegal and punishable to teach enslaved people to read, 95% of the formerly enslaved population was illiterate, not because they lacked the intelligence or the desire, because the system had specifically and deliberately denied them this tool, understanding clearly that literacy is power, that the ability to read a contract is the difference between being defrauded and being protected, that the ability to write a letter is the difference between silence and a voice. So these words traveled by voice. They moved from the Osterman Building to the courthouse steps, to the walls of shops and churches, and from there they were carried mouth to ear and voice to voice out of Galveston and across the flat coastal plain and into the interior of the state where the cotton plantations stretched for miles and the words hadn't arrived yet. They were carried by soldiers on horseback, by freed people who had heard the news in the city and were already moving, by travelers on the roads, by every available human channel of communication in a state that was enormous and had no telegraph reaching every county. But here's what gets left out of the clean version of this story. The order doesn't end with absolute equality of personal rights. It continues. It advises the freedmen, a new word, the word for what you are now, to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. It informs them that they will not be allowed to collect a military post and will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. In the same breath that declares your freedom, it tells you to stay where you are. Work for wages now, which is technically an improvement over working for nothing. But the announcement of freedom comes bundled with an instruction not to exercise it in any way that would inconvenience the surrounding white community. The Union Army had a real problem, and it was the same problem they'd had everywhere emancipation reached. 250,000 free people suddenly needed to eat, to shelter, to move, to find the children who had been sold away, to build something from nothing in a world that had been engineered specifically to prevent them from doing so. The army couldn't feed them all. The military posts couldn't house them. And so the Declaration of Freedom arrived with a rider attached. Be free, but please be free in a way that doesn't require us to actually provide for you while you figure out how to do that. This is the contradiction at the heart of General Order Number 3, and it is worth sitting with. Freedom was real. It was also hedged and qualified and immediately contested by the men who had the most to lose from it, becoming real in any practical sense. The formerly Confederate mayor of Galveston attempted, within hours of the order, to redirect freed people back to their former work. He was overruled briefly by military authority. In Houston, in the days that followed, white residents stopped black people in the streets and demanded to know who their owners were. When those people refused to answer or couldn't name a former enslaver, they were accused of vagrancy and put to work for the city, slavery wearing the clothes of civic order. And it was happening within 1 week of the order that had declared the absolute equality of personal rights. Let's be honest about what this means. The gap between legal freedom and practical freedom, between what the law said and what life actually was, remained enormous. It would remain enormous for a very long time. And the people receiving the news of General Order Number 3, the people celebrating in the streets of Galveston, they knew this. They weren't naive about it. They had been reading the white community with acute precision for their entire lives, because the price of misreading it had always been severe. They could see the sharecropping system being designed in real time. They could see the black codes being drafted. They could see that the infrastructure of racial domination was not destroyed. It was reorganizing. They celebrated anyway. This is the part I need you to hold. This is the part that everything else rests on. The men and women who sang in the streets of Galveston on June 19th, 1865, were not celebrating because they thought everything was about to be fine. They were celebrating because what had been declared, however imperfect, however contested, however surrounded by the attempts of powerful men to limit its practical effect, was still the thing they had been waiting for. The legal recognition that they were human beings with absolute rights. That was new. That mattered. The fact that people would spend the next century trying to walk it back, made it matter more, not less. They were celebrating the crack in the foundation. They were celebrating because the crack, now that it existed, could be pulled at and widened and eventually made into a door. Felix Haywood, formerly enslaved, described what he saw and felt on June 19, 1865, with a plainness that no scholar has ever improved on. He said years later, soldiers, all of a sudden, was everywhere, coming in, bunches, crossing and walking and riding. Everyone was a-singing. We was all walking on golden clouds. Hallelujah. Walking on golden clouds, in June, in Texas. While all of it was already visible on the horizon, the violence, the coercion, the new mechanisms of control, people were walking on golden clouds. You hold that. Now let's talk about what happened in the days and weeks after June 19th, because this is where the human story lives. The news moved slowly out of Galveston. Texas is an enormous state, larger than France, and the order posted on a building on the Strand did not reach a plantation in the Brazos River bottomlands immediately. It took weeks in some places, months in others. Some enslavers, when soldiers arrived at their gates, gathered their workers and delivered the news with some version of dignity. Others made it complicated, conditional, asked for clarifications about timing, told their workers that the harvest had to come in first, that this was for everyone's benefit, that leaving now with nothing was dangerous, and the sensible thing was to stay and finish the season. And because leaving meant walking out into a world where you had no money, no land, no legal documentation of your own identity, no alternative housing, no credit, and no guarantee that the white man you'd meet on the road ahead would respect the order any more than the white man you were leaving behind. Some people stayed, at least temporarily, because freedom that you can't afford to exercise is a different kind of freedom, and the people who designed the post-slavery economy of Texas understood exactly how to make it unaffordable. But others left immediately. Within hours, they walked off the plantation without a conversation, and without looking back, and without giving anyone the satisfaction of an explanation. Some walked for days to reach a town with a Freedmen's Bureau office or a Union Army presence. They walked in the heat, carrying whatever they owned, which was often not much. They walked through land they had worked for decades but did not own. They walked past houses they had built, fields they had cleared, roads they had maintained. All of that labor had produced something, and none of it had produced anything for them. They walked away from it, knowing that they were owed and would never be paid, and chose to take the one thing that couldn't be denied them, the act of leaving. Think about what it means to walk down a road you've never been allowed to walk without a pass. The road looks exactly as it always did. The dust is the same June dust. The heat is the same heat on the back of your neck. But something in the act of walking is categorically different. Your feet feel different. Your eyes work differently. You can look at the horizon. You can look all the way ahead without calculating the cost. You are not going towards something assigned. You are going towards something chosen. Even if you don't know yet exactly where you're going, the direction is yours. That is new. That is so profoundly bone-deep new that some people, by documented account, simply stopped walking and sat down at the side of the road for a while just to feel it. The women of June 19th, 1865 deserve their own telling, because the standard Juneteenth narrative tends to center the public moments. The general, the balcony, the reading of the order, the singing in the streets. And the women's story is quieter and more intimate, and in many ways more devastating. enslaved women in Texas had not been only laborers. They had been mothers who watched children sold away, women forced into sexual relationships with enslavers and denied any recourse, women who nursed the enslavers' children while their own children grew up in the quarters, women who performed the most intimate domestic labor of the planter household, the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the nursing, and who were required to do it with an exterior of deference that bore no relationship to their interior life. When freedom came, the first thing many of them did was not celebrate in the streets. The first thing many of them did was try to find their children. A daughter sold when she was 7. A son sold to a different county 3 years ago. A husband taken to East Texas in 1858 by the enslaver who bought him. The search for separated family was the first and most urgent project of freedom for enormous numbers of people, and it was a project that required new tools none of them had possessed before. The ability to walk somewhere without permission, the ability to speak to a government agent, the ability to place an advertisement in a newspaper asking for information about a missing person. Dozens of such advertisements appeared in Texas newspapers in the months after June 19th, placed by formerly enslaved people who could not write, but who had friends or bureau agents write for them. Have you seen a woman named Sarah, formerly enslaved in Harris County, sold approximately 1856? Her daughter Agnes is looking for her. With the soldiers came Major General Gordon Granger, a career army officer who had been given what was, in the long view of history, one of the most consequential assignments ever handed to a Union general. Take command of the District of Texas and tell the people that the war is over and the enslaved are free. Let's spend a moment with Galveston, because Galveston in 1865 is not a small frontier town. It is the largest city in Texas, a proper port city sitting on a narrow barrier island at the mouth of Galveston Bay, connected to the mainland by a long wooden bridge. In 1865, Galveston is the commercial heart of Texas. Cotton comes through here, dry goods come in, ships from New Orleans and New York and Liverpool dock along the Strand, and the city has the dense, layered social world that port cities develop when money and commerce and people of different origins mix together under one humid sky. The streets are paved with oyster shells. The air smells like brine and fish and the sweeter smell of the Gulf. And in June, it smells also like heat. The thick, personal kind of heat that sits on you like a second skin. White egrets stand at the water's edge in the mornings. Pelicans work the harbor. Galveston also has a black population that predates the Confederacy. Free black residents have lived on this island alongside enslaved ones for decades. There is community here, institutional life, the skeleton of what will become an extraordinary story of rebuilding. Most importantly, there is Reedy Chapel AME Church, established in 1848. For 17 years, this church has been a gathering place for black residents of Galveston, enslaved and free, in all the complicated categories that Galveston's port society creates. It is a place of prayer and mutual aid and, in the ways that all black churches in this era function, a place of quiet and persistent resistance. June 19th, 1865, Reedy Chapel AME is the last stop on General Granger's march through the city to post and read the order. It is a fitting ending for the route, that the Declaration of Freedom should arrive finally at the oldest house of black worship on the island. Granger and his men spend June 18th establishing headquarters at the Osterman Building, at the corner of 22nd and Strand. The next morning, Monday, June 19th, he issues General Order Number 3, and the world, or at least the world as it has existed in Texas for 2.5 centuries, cracks open at the seam. The order itself is brief. It says, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor." Absolute equality of personal rights. Can you imagine hearing those 4 words for the first time? Not reading them, because in 1865, 95% of enslaved people in Texas were illiterate, not through any failure of intelligence or ambition, but because teaching enslaved people to read had been systematically forbidden, made illegal in some counties, punished with violence. They heard these words, spoken, carried by voice from the Osterman building to the courthouse steps, to the walls of shops and churches, and then passed mouth to ear and mouth to ear out of Galveston and across the flat coastal plains of East Texas and into the deep interior of the state where the cotton plantations stretched for miles. Passed by soldiers riding horseback into the countryside. Passed by free people walking the roads. Passed by formerly enslaved people who had gotten the news in Galveston and were already moving, already in motion, already taking freedom for a first terrifying run. But here's what nobody talks about at the barbecue. The order doesn't end with absolute equality of personal rights. That would have been a cleaner document. The order continues. It advises the freed men. That's the word now, the new word. The word you're hearing for the first time applied to you. It advises the freedmen to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. It informs them that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. In the same breath that declares your freedom, you are told to stay put. Work for wages now, which is technically an improvement over working for nothing, but the improvement comes packaged with an instruction not to go anywhere inconvenient with it. The Union Army had a logistical problem, and it was the same problem everywhere emancipation had arrived before. 250,000 free people suddenly needed to eat, needed shelter, needed to move, needed to find family. Members who had been sold away needed to build some version of a new life from an absolute zero of material resources. The military posts couldn't house them. The government had no mechanism in place to provide for them. The 40 acres and a mule that the radical Republicans had talked about, that General Sherman had promised, that had already been walked back by Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, who had no interest in distributing Confederate land to formerly enslaved people, and a great deal of interest in maintaining his political alliances with white Southerners. There would be no land. There would be wages, theoretically, and there would be the instruction to remain quietly at home. So, be free, but not too free. Be liberated, but please don't trouble anyone about it. Congratulations. Welcome to the first day of your liberation. You are legally a person now. Try not to be too much of one. Now let me tell you what actually happened in Galveston on that Monday morning, because the official version of the story, the general reads the order, joyous celebrations erupt, everyone goes home happy, is only half of a far more complicated picture. There were celebrations, real ones, the singing that rose from Reedy Chapel A.M. E-Church that afternoon was not performance. It was the actual sound of human beings trying to push something too large for any one body through the only channels they had. Voice and breath and the ancient language of the sacred. People embraced in the streets with the uninhibited physical directness of people who had never been allowed to display public emotion of any kind without permission. There were people laughing in a way that had nothing to do with anything funny. the way laughter comes out when it's the only shape big enough for what you're feeling. There were old men sitting down in the middle of the street because their legs gave out, and they didn't particularly care who saw it. But there was also immediate, stubborn, infuriating resistance from the people who had the most to lose from this particular development. The former Confederate mayor of Galveston made his position clear within hours of the order. The formerly enslaved people of Galveston were to return to their work. He used his remaining civic authority to attempt to enforce this. He was, briefly and pointlessly, outranked. Union soldiers were not impressed, but his attempt tells you something important about the texture of that day. That freedom was not simply declared and received. It was declared and then immediately contested by men who had spent their lives building a world on the premise that it could never be declared, and who had not yet accepted that the world had changed. In Houston, in the days that followed the declaration, white residents stopped black people in the streets and demanded to know who their owners were. When the people they stopped refused to name a former enslaver, they were accused of vagrancy and put to work for the city. This is slavery wearing different clothes. Specifically, it's slavery wearing the clothes of civic order and public safety. And it was happening within a week of the order that declared the absolute equality of personal rights. The distance between what the law said and what life actually was remained an enormous gap, and the people who had profited from that gap were already working to preserve it. Here's what never stops being remarkable, though. In the face of all of this, the immediate defiance, the new restrictions already being drafted, the instruction to stay put and work for wages, the old men who would have you know that freedom was contingent and conditional and would be fought at every corner, black Texans were celebrating. They were celebrating with everything they had, and they were celebrating in full knowledge of what was coming, because they had been watching this world closely for a long time, and they understood its mechanics better than any of the men issuing the orders. They knew about sharecropping before sharecropping had a name. They had been reading the white community for their entire lives because your survival depended on reading it accurately, and they could see that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was a different phase of the same fight. They celebrated anyway, because what had been declared, however imperfectly, however surrounded by qualifications and caveats, was still the thing they had been waiting for. The legal recognition that they were human beings, that their personal rights were absolute, that the man or woman standing in front of you was no longer your property and never could be again. That, specifically and exactly, was worth celebrating, worth singing about until your voice gave out, worth sitting down in the middle of a dusty street in Galveston in June, because the wait was finally off. The formerly enslaved man Felix Haywood, whose recollections were recorded as part of the slave narrative project decades later when he was an old man, described the experience of that day with a directness that no scholarly analysis has ever improved on. He said, soldiers, all of a sudden, was everywhere, coming in bunches, crossing and walking and riding. Everyone was a-singing. We was all walking on golden clouds, hallelujah. Walking on golden clouds, in June, in Texas, with all of it, the dispossession, the violence, the black codes already being drafted, the sharecropping system already being designed, the whole apparatus of white supremacy already scrambling to reconstruct itself in the wreckage of the Confederacy. People were walking on golden clouds. You hold that. The news moved. It had to move the hard way, because Texas in 1865 has no telegraph reaching every plantation, no newspaper landing on every doorstep, no radio or fast horse courier system, or any of the things that would make rapid communication possible. The order was posted in public places throughout Galveston and read aloud at several points through the city. From there, it traveled by word of mouth, by soldiers on horseback riding into the interior, by freed people who had heard the news in the city and were already walking outward into the countryside. The 114th Ohio Infantry, one of the regiments stationed in Galveston, was sent inland to Milliken, Texas, with the specific assignment of carrying the news directly to plantations that hadn't yet received it. These soldiers would arrive at a plantation gate, speak to the enslaver first, because the military's chain of communication still ran through the white property owner, which tells you something about the limitations of even well-intentioned reform, and then require the enslaver to gather his workers and have the order read to them. Some enslavers, surrounded by armed Union soldiers and confronted with the unmistakable end of everything they had built their world around, managed some version of dignity in that moment. They gathered their workers and read the order and told them they were free and that anyone who wanted to leave could leave. Most did not. Most made it complicated, made it conditional, asked questions about timing, about the harvest, about whether there was some way to interpret the order that meant it didn't have to apply yet. There's a particular kind of man who, when confronted by the moral reckoning of his entire life, responds by asking for a clarification on the paperwork. Texas in June 1865 was full of that kind of man. There are documented accounts of enslavers who, upon being informed that they were required to free their workers, told their workers the news and then immediately offered them a deal. Stay through the harvest. The crop is almost ready. You'll receive wages at the end of the season. What choice do you have practically? You have no money, no land, no tools, no legal documentation of your own existence, no credit history, no place to go where someone isn't going to demand to know who your former owner was. The arithmetic of sudden freedom was stark and had been deliberately engineered to be stark. You were free and you owned nothing, which meant in the very short term, your freedom was a moral reality in a world designed to make it practically impossible to exercise. Some people stayed on those plantations, not because they wanted to, but because the options weren't there yet, because the Freedmen's Bureau office was 40 miles away on foot, through country where white men on horses were still asking black people for their passes, and the old habits of violence hadn't yet processed the information that they were no longer legally sanctioned. Others walked off the same morning the news arrived, without a conversation, without notice, without giving the enslaver the satisfaction of an explanation. They left. Some of them walked for days. Some walked with nothing at all, because anything they had was technically owned by the man they were leaving. They walked toward Galveston, toward the Union Army encampments, toward the Freedmen's Bureau office, toward any town with a telegraph or a post office or a church, where people might know what happened next. They walked toward each other, because here is the thing that the legal language of General Order No. 3 cannot fully capture. Freedom, for the people who had been denied it longest, meant first and most urgently, find your family. The enslaved men and women of Texas had been subjected for decades to the systematic destruction of their family relationships. Children sold away. Husbands and wives separated when one was sold to a different county or a different state. Parents watching their adult children driven off in coffles to the Deep South. The internal slave trade, which moved hundreds of thousands of enslaved people from the Upper South to the cotton and sugar kingdoms of the Lower South between 1820 and 1860, had been a machine specifically designed to sever every tie of kinship and community that enslaved people formed. Freedom, on its first morning, meant names, spoken out loud. Your daughter, sold when she was 7, sent to Brazoria County. Your brother, sold up the Red River sometime in the 1850s. You've heard nothing since. Your mother, still on the plantation you were separated from in 1858, 200 miles away. The roads out of Galveston on June 19, and in the days that followed began filling with people walking, just walking, in the direction of someone they loved and had been kept from. They walked with nothing except the names of the people they were looking for and the knowledge that for the first time in their lives, no one could legally make them stop. Some of those reunions happened, documented in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, which in September 1865 began operations in Texas under the command of Major General Edgar Gregory, are thousands of letters, requests, advertisements, testimonies, the paper trail of people trying to find each other. A man named Hawkins Wilson, freed and living in Galveston, wrote to the Bureau in 1867, "I am anxious to learn about my sisters, from whom I have been separated many years." He included names, descriptions, whatever he could remember about where they had been when he last saw them. His letter is one of thousands like it in the Bureau's records, the largest single archive of the separated black family in American history, one that scholars are still working through today. Some of those reunions never happened. The distances were too great, the records too sparse, the trail too cold. There were men and women who walked for months and found nothing, who discovered that the person they were looking for had died, had been moved again, had been taken somewhere that left no paper trace. Freedom arrived, and the grief it enabled. The grief of finally being able to ask questions you couldn't safely ask before was immense. You carried it alongside the joy. You carried both things at once, which is a different kind of carrying than anything that had come before. Now let me take you into the specific physical experience of the weeks after June 19th, because this is where the story gets granular, and granular is where it gets real. Imagine you are a woman. You are somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. You have been enslaved your entire life on a cotton plantation in the interior of Texas, in Brazos County or Wharton County, or somewhere in the flat, humid coastal plain where cotton grows shoulder high and the heat comes up off the rows in visible waves. You heard the news 3 weeks after June 19th, when a Union soldier arrived at the plantation gate and the enslaver came out of the big house looking like a man who has just been informed his house is on fire. You understood what was happening before the soldier finished reading because you had known for 2 years this moment was coming. Because enslaved people in Texas knew what the Emancipation Proclamation said, even though they weren't allowed to read it. Because knowledge passed through a community that was forbidden to communicate in any official way, had developed unofficial channels of extraordinary efficiency. You are free. You have heard the words. You have watched the soldier leave. You have watched the enslaver go back into his house. You are still standing in the same field you were standing in yesterday. What do you do first? For many women, the answer is your children. You go to find your children. If your children are there, on this plantation, you put your hands on them. If they aren't, if they were sold away, you start asking. You start talking to the other women who were sold here from the same region you came from, who might know someone who might know something. You start building a network of information from scratch, using the same invisible communication channels that told you about the Emancipation Proclamation in the first place, turning them now toward the question of where your daughter is, where your son is, whether the man you married in an unsanctioned ceremony 8 years ago is still alive somewhere in Brazoria County. For men who had been the most physically mobile, who had been hired out or sent on errands or worked in positions that gave them some movement. For those men, the first act of freedom was sometimes literal physical walking, away from the plantation, down the road, past the edge of the property without asking permission, in a direction chosen by themselves. This sounds small. It was enormous. The right to choose your own direction, to be on a road at night without a pass, to not stop when a white man on horseback called out to ask you where you were going. These were the first tests of freedom, and they were being run in real time, in the late summer heat of Texas, on roads that were suddenly and disconcertingly full of formerly enslaved people moving in every direction they had chosen for themselves. The Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen and Abandoned Lands, established by Congress in March 1865, was supposed to be the mechanism that managed this transition. Its mandate was ambitious, and its resources were catastrophically insufficient. It was charged with providing food, clothing, medical care, and legal protection to the formerly enslaved. It was charged with negotiating fair labor contracts between freed people and the planters who still controlled all the land. It was charged with establishing schools, registering marriages, helping people find separated family members, and serving as legal advocates for black Texans in a court system designed to work against them. It had 6 years to accomplish all of this, a skeleton staff, no dedicated funding from Congress, and was operating in a state where the legal and political establishment was not only unhelpful, but actively hostile to everything it was trying to do. In Texas specifically, the Bureau began operating in September 1865, 3 months after Juneteenth. Its first commissioner, General Edgar Gregory, despite being an abolitionist by conviction, found himself making accommodations to the practical reality of Texas politics that would have been recognizable to anyone who has watched idealistic policy run into structural resistance. Within a year, his labor policies had effectively pushed most freed people back to work on the same plantations, often for the same former enslavers, on terms that were technically wages, but practically kept people in the same cycles of debt and dependency that slavery had created. The dream of land redistribution, the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Andrew Johnson had reversed Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 before it could be implemented. There would be no land, there would be contracts, and the contracts were being written by men who had very recently owned the people signing them. This is the context in which the freedom colonies were built, not from government support, not from the redistribution of Confederate land to the people whose labor had built it, from nothing, or very nearly nothing, through the accumulated labor of people who had nothing and built anyway. From 1865 to 1930, formerly enslaved Texans and their children founded more than 550 communities, settlements, towns across the state. Historians call them freedom colonies. Some were tiny, a few families clustered around a church and a school. Some grew into proper communities with stores and post offices and their own newspapers. They were built in the places nobody else wanted: flood-prone creek bottoms, marginal farmland on the edges of county lines, the sandy uplands and pine forests of East Texas, where the soil was too poor for profitable cotton. They were built precisely there because that was the land that could be acquired, a few dollars an acre, by people who were earning wages for the first time and saving every penny they could. And what anchored every one of those settlements, the single institution without which no freedom colony could survive, the beating heart of every community, was the church. Not just for worship, though worship was essential. The church was the school on weekdays. The church was the meeting house where community decisions were made. The church was the court of mutual aid, where families in crisis were helped by people who had nothing to spare but gave it anyway. The church was the place where marriages that had been impossible to legalize under slavery were now officially witnessed, where children were baptized with names that were finally, fully, legally their own, where funerals were held for people whose deaths could now be properly grieved and remembered. In every freedom colony in Texas, the church stood first. Everything else was built around it. The schools came next, and the hunger for education in the wake of emancipation is one of the most powerful and consistently underemphasized facts in American history. In 1865, 95% of formerly enslaved people in Texas were illiterate, not because they lacked the intelligence or the desire to learn, but because the state had systematically, sometimes violently, forbidden their education. The first thing enormous numbers of free people asked for was a teacher. They established schools in church buildings, in private homes, in whatever space was available. Northern missionary societies sent teachers south. The American Missionary Association established schools throughout Texas, beginning in 1865. Freed people themselves became teachers. By the end of 1865, more than 90,000 formerly enslaved people were enrolled in Freedmen's Bureau-supported schools across the South. People who had spent their entire lives being forbidden to read were learning to read, and they were doing it with a focus and intensity that astonished even the teachers they had asked for. There is something profound and specifically determined about this. The people of Texas who had been told, for generations, that they were incapable of learning and unworthy of education. Those people, in the weeks and months after Juneteenth, built schools with their own hands, from their own money, with teachers they had recruited and paid for themselves when the Bureau's resources ran out, because they understood something the people who had denied them education had also understood, that literacy is power, that the ability to read a contract is the difference between being defrauded and being protected, that the ability to write a letter is the difference between silence and voice. They came to their education with the urgency of people who had already waited a lifetime for it and were not prepared to wait another day. Now, let me bring you back to the celebration. Let me bring you back to what Juneteenth actually was. In those first years when the community was building it from the ground up and deciding what it would mean. Some of those reunions happened. Some happened months later, after months of letters and bureau visits and word-of-mouth networks traveling across hundreds of miles of Texas countryside. The Freedmen's Bureau records, the largest single archive of the separated black family in American history, contain thousands of these requests, these letters, these registrations of missing relatives. Scholars are still working through them. Families are still finding each other through them. Some of those reunions never happened. The trade had scattered people too far. The records were too sparse. The people they were looking for had died or been moved again, or simply disappeared into the vast, uncatalogued human geography of the antebellum South. Freedom arrived, and it enabled a grief that hadn't been safe to feel before. The full, unhidden grief of understanding. The full, unhidden extent of what had been stolen. You carried both things at once. The extraordinary joy of freedom and the full accounting of what freedom was revealing you had lost. Both things at once. That is a different kind of carrying than anything that had come before. The Freedmen's Bureau began operations in Texas in September 1865, 3 months after Juneteenth. Its first commissioner, General Edgar Gregory, an abolitionist by conviction, found himself almost immediately compromised by the practical reality of Texas politics. His mission was ambitious, provide food and medical care, negotiate fair labor contracts, establish schools, reunite families, provide legal protection. His resources were inadequate to the ambition by an order of magnitude. The Bureau distributed some 15 million rations of food to freed people across the South between 1865 and 1869. It established schools. By the end of 1865, more than 90,000 formerly enslaved people across the South were enrolled in Freedmen's Bureau schools. It recorded marriages because one of the first things people did upon receiving freedom was formalize the family relationships that the law had never recognized before. A man named Hawkins Wilson, freed in Galveston, wrote to the Bureau in 1867, "I am anxious to learn about my sisters, from whom I have been separated many years." He included what details he had. He wanted to find them. His letter is one of thousands like it that tell you more about what freedom actually meant to the people who received it than any proclamation or general order ever could. But Gregory's labor policies, shaped by the political pressures of a state where white hostility to black freedom was universal among the powerful and backed by violence, ended up pushing most freed people back to work on the same plantations, often for the same former enslavers. The dream of land redistribution, the 40 acres and a mule that radical Republicans had promised, that Sherman had outlined in Special Field, Order Number 15, had already been reversed by Andrew Johnson before it could be implemented. Johnson, a Democrat who had been placed on the Republican ticket as a unity gesture during the war, had no interest in redistributing Confederate land to formerly enslaved people and every interest in maintaining his political alliances with the white Southern elite. There would be no land. There would be wages, negotiated under contracts written by men who had recently owned the people signing them, in a system designed by those same men to ensure that the wages never quite covered the debts being accumulated. This was sharecropping, and sharecropping was built very fast, in the summer and fall of 1865, while Juneteenth was still new. The cotton crop still had to be harvested. The planters still had the land. The formerly enslaved had nothing but their labor. The sharecrop system said, "Work this land, take a share of the crop, pay your housing and seed and tools out of your share." The Yaz, arithmetic, was always wrong. The debts were always larger than the shares. The system was perpetual motion toward perpetual debt, and it was designed that way. The men who built sharecropping had just been told they could no longer own people outright. They built the next best thing, a system that bound people to the land through economics instead of law, that made leaving practically impossible because you owed more than you could ever earn, that used debt and violence and legal structures all pointed in the same direction to achieve what slavery had achieved more directly. And yet, the people it was designed to trap built around it, because the history of Black Texas after Juneteenth is not just the history of what was done to people, it's the history of what people built despite it. From 1865 to 1930, formerly enslaved Texans and their children founded more than 550 distinct communities across the state. Historians call them freedom colonies, a name that captures exactly what they were. Not random settlements, not temporary encampments, not the accidental aggregation of people with nowhere else to go. Intentional communities, built deliberately in the places nobody else wanted. Flood-prone creek bottoms, sandy uplands, marginal land at the edges of county lines, because those were the places that could be acquired for a few dollars an acre by people who had just started earning wages for the first time. and were saving with extraordinary discipline toward the specific goal of owning ground. These communities were built from a specific blueprint, the same blueprint in every colony. First the church, then the school. The church came first because the church was already the institution that black communities had been building and maintaining under the most extreme constraints imaginable. In the quarters and in the spaces between shifts, in the secret meetings that enslaved people held when the enslavers weren't watching, the spiritual community had been forming for generations. It arrived at freedom already organized, already experienced in maintaining itself under hostile conditions, already in possession of the infrastructure of mutual aid and shared meaning that a community needs to survive. The church building went up first. Everything else was built around it. Then the school. The hunger for education in the aftermath of emancipation is one of the most consistently under-discussed facts in American history. In 1865, 95% of formerly enslaved people in Texas could not read, not because they were incapable, but because they had been systematically, sometimes violently, prevented. The first and most insistent demand that freed people made of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Northern Missionary Societies and any available resource was send teachers, establish schools. People who had never been allowed to learn were learning with an urgency that astonished the teachers they had asked for. Old people and young people sitting in the same rough schoolrooms, working through the same primers, because the alphabet had been kept from them and they intended to have it now, not as a luxury, as a weapon, as protection, as the difference between being at the mercy of every contract written by someone else and being able to read it yourself. The American Missionary Association sent teachers throughout Texas beginning in 1865. Howard University, Fisk University, Morehouse College. These institutions of higher education for Black Americans were established during the Reconstruction era, built on the idea that the hunger for learning that freedom had released needed institutional form to sustain it. In every freedom colony, the school followed the church with as little delay as the community could manage. Now let me bring you back to Juneteenth itself, because the holiday and the community that built it are the same story. The first formal anniversary celebration of June 19 happened in Houston on June 19, 1866. Houston appears to have been the first community to mark the anniversary on the anniversary date itself, which matters because the specific date, the specific act of choosing June 19th rather than January 1st or some other day, was the community's way of anchoring the memory to the specific physical moment when the news arrived in Texas. Not when Lincoln signed the paper, not when the war ended, when the soldiers arrived in Galveston and the words were spoken and the people heard them. The Houston Tri-Weekly Telegraph, a newspaper whose coverage managed to be simultaneously factually accurate and ideologically distorted, because its editors felt compelled to frame everything through the lens of the former slaveholders' benevolence, reported on a procession through the city streets, followed by a grand barbecue. A procession through the city streets. Formerly enslaved people and free black residents and their children, 1 year out of bondage, walking in formation through the public streets of Houston as a deliberate act of public self-assertion. Not because they needed to travel between 2 points, because the walking together was itself the statement. We are here. These are our streets too. You will see us in them. The march was the message. The barbecue that followed was not an afterthought. It was central. The deep history of communal barbecue in Black Southern culture runs back through the specific skills of enslaved people, who were the primary practitioners of the craft of slow-cooking meat over coals in the South. a technique with roots in West African culinary traditions, developed and adapted across generations of cooking in conditions that made efficiency and community feeding essential. Enslaved people had cooked barbecue for the enslavers who exploited their skill at it. They had cooked for plantation celebrations they were required to prepare, but not always invited to enjoy in full. At the first Juneteenth barbecues, the skill was the same, and the fire was the same, and the meat was the same. The difference was who the table was set for. The labor and the feast both belonged to the community. That difference is the whole world. Long trenches filled with mesquite and oak coals, grates laid across them, pork ribs and brisket and chicken, and whatever game the community had been able to put together. Slow cooking through the afternoon while people prayed and told stories and found each other in the crowd. Children running between the adults' legs. Old people sitting in chairs that someone had carried out from the church. The smoke rising above Houston in thick columns that you could see from several blocks away, and everyone who saw the smoke knew what it meant. And the red drinks. Every account of those earliest celebrations includes them. Red soda water, strawberry drinks, hibiscus water. Red in every form that could be sweetened and poured, served in generous quantities, present at every Juneteenth gathering from the very beginning. The significance of red in West African cultural traditions, where it appears in many cultures as a color connected to power, to vitality, to ancestral force, to the presence of the living past among the living present, survived the Middle Passage in fragmented but persistent form. The red drink at Juneteenth celebrations is one of those fragments. Its specific meaning got debated, and its origins got blurred by the centuries of systematic cultural destruction that slavery required. But its presence never wavered. Year after year, generation after generation, someone was making the red drink, and someone was drinking it, and something in the doing of it kept a thread alive that connected the celebration to something older and deeper than the specific date of June 19th, 1865. The prayer services were the spine of it all. The church communities of Black Texas brought to Juneteenth the same compressed spiritual vocabulary they had, developed through generations of worship under conditions that required every word to carry multiple meanings. The spirituals they sang at Juneteenth, Swing, Low Sweet Chariot, Go Down Moses, I'll Fly Away, were at one level religious expression, and at another level a map of everything that had been endured and everything that was still being asked of God. The Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud at those services, not because people didn't know what it said, because the reading was a ritual act, a ceremony, a way of saying collectively, we remember what came before and we know why we're here. The oldest people in the congregation, who had been enslaved their entire lives, sat in those pews, and their presence was the purpose. They were the living connection between what had been and what was being built. The reason they needed their own land for these celebrations tells you something ugly and essential about where they lived. White-controlled city governments throughout Texas had begun restricting black access to public parks. The public parks that existed were not for everyone, so the community bought their own. Emancipation Park in Houston, Booker T. Washington Park in Mexia, 30 acres purchased in 1898, site of the longest-running continuous Juneteenth celebration in the state. Emancipation Park in East Austin, acquired by the Travis County Emancipation Celebration Association. Land bought by the 19th of June Association in Limestone County. All across Texas, the community was purchasing ground and calling it free ground. Because if the existing public spaces were closed, they would build new ones. because the celebration was worth the cost, because June 19th was worth having a permanent home. The celebrations grew through the late 19th and early 20th centuries into something far more complex than a picnic. They were multi-day civic events that combined the sacred and the secular in the specific way Black communal life had always combined them, because in Black community practice, the sacred and the secular were never as separable as mainstream white American culture liked to pretend. Prayer services and political speeches in the same afternoon program. Voter registration at the same tables as the food. Black politicians and community leaders giving speeches about rights and civic participation to audiences who understood that freedom had to be exercised constantly and publicly, or it would be taken back. And it was being taken back. The years of the Juneteenth celebrations' growth were also the years of the nadir, the documented peak of lynching in America, the disenfranchisement campaigns, the systematic rollback of Reconstruction-era gains. The celebration was not happening in a vacuum of peace. It was happening in conditions that required it to happen. There were rodeos at Juneteenth. This matters. Black cowboys were a foundational and systematically erased element of the Texas cattle industry. 1 in 4 working cowboys on the great cattle drives was black. Men whose skill with horses and cattle was essential to the industry that defined Texas identity, who received the most dangerous work and the least recognition, who were written out of the cowboy mythology almost from the beginning of that mythology's existence. The Juneteenth rodeo was a reclamation. The same skills, the same physical mastery, the same knowledge of animals and land and weather, performed now for an audience that knew the full history of who had those skills and why they had them, and what it had cost to acquire and maintain them under the conditions they'd been acquired under. When a black cowboy rode in the Juneteenth rodeo, the crowd watching knew they were seeing something the wider world was pretending didn't exist. The 1936 Juneteenth celebration in Dallas, marking both Texas's centennial and the 75th anniversary of emancipation, drew a crowd estimated between 150,000 and 200,000 people. Cab Calloway performed. A 30-minute segment of African-American folk music from the celebration was broadcast nationally on NBC radio. 200,000 people gathered for their Independence Day, their actual Independence Day, the day that meant freedom was real rather than theoretical. And the mainstream American public still largely didn't know the day existed. In 1940, Louis Jordan recorded Juneteenth Jamboree, bringing the celebration into popular music and describing General Granger as a hip cat in a chorus that featured trumpets flaring in the air and mellow barbecue everywhere. The song is joyful and absurd and completely right. That's how you survive 100 years of celebrating freedom in a country that won't recognize the celebration. You make it swing. The mid-20th century brought different pressures. As the civil rights movement gathered force in the 1950s and 60s, Juneteenth began to feel to some in the community like it belonged to a different historical register. The holiday of emancipation felt distant from the urgent work of demanding the civil rights that emancipation had theoretically established. Some celebrations went dormant. Austin's went on a 25-year hiatus. The holiday that had been growing since 1866 contracted, but it didn't die. The tradition was too deep, too embedded in too many families, too carried in the bodies of too many people who had been present at celebrations their grandparents told them about. And in the 1970s, it began reviving, finding new generations who recognized in it something they needed. something the civil rights movement had not made irrelevant. The movement had changed what was legally possible. Juneteenth was about what had already been built. Over 100 years of celebrating despite everything, the culture and the memory and the specific, irreplaceable practice of honoring the people who came before. They set off the celebrations that began in Houston in 1866 and have run without fundamental interruption for 160 years. They set off the purchase of Emancipation Park and the building of the Freedom Colonies and the establishment of the church schools and the Freedmen's Bureau classrooms and the HBCUs that those classrooms eventually became. They set off the rodeos and the barbecue and the red soda water and the reading of the proclamation aloud year after year, not because people forgot it, but because the ritual of remembering it was the point. They set off a tradition of celebrating freedom with the specific quality of celebration that belongs to people who know exactly what freedom cost, who paid the price themselves or received it from someone who did, who understand that joy and memory are not opposites, but the same thing from different angles. The truth about the very first Juneteenth is that it was messy and contested and surrounded on all sides by people trying to limit its effect. Freedom arrived 2.5 years late, in a state where the people with power had known it was coming and had been deliberately delaying it, on a morning when the same order that declared absolute equality also told people to stay home and work for wages. The truth is that freedom that morning was legal but not yet practical, declared but not yet delivered, a promise the country would spend the next century slowly and unevenly and incompletely making good on. And the truth is also this: it was still everything. After centuries of a system that had reduced human beings to accounting entries, the declaration of absolute equality of personal rights, however incomplete in practice, however surrounded by the attempts of powerful men to hollow it out, was a crack in a foundation that had been built to last forever. And people began pulling at that crack the same day. They walked off plantations without saying goodbye. They prayed in the streets with their real faces on for the first time. They found each other on the roads. They fed each other at tables that belonged to them. They bought ground and called it free ground. They told their children about this day, and their children told their children. And 160 years later, someone is still cooking the barbecue and pouring the red drink and saying the names of the people who came before. They were here. They built this. They made a holiday from a day when freedom was technically declared and mostly still withheld, in a state where the people running things had known about the law for years and ignored it for as long as they could. They made that holiday last through the worst of what the country had to offer. They made it grow until the whole country had to recognize it. The stubborn, defiant, love-powered persistence of that is the real story of Juneteenth. Not the general on the balcony, but the people who celebrated anyway and kept celebrating until the celebration was undeniable. You can let this settle tonight. You've sat with Galveston in June, in the heat and the brine, on the morning the air changed. You've walked the roads where freedom was being tested one step at a time. You've been in Reedy Chapel AMA when the singing went up. You've watched Jack Yates raise $1,000 in a community that had been kept from having money and buy 10 acres in 3rd Ward and call it Emancipation Park. You've watched Opal Lee walk her 2.5 miles every year until the country finally listened. The woman who walked off the plantation without a word, carrying nothing but the names of her children. The man sitting in the middle of the road in Galveston because his legs gave out under the weight of what he'd just heard. The children running through the streets, not quite grasping what had changed, but running anyway, because the adults around them were transformed, and transformation is contagious, and you don't need to understand something to feel it. The old woman who had been enslaved for 60 years and stood on June 19th in the heat and received the news with something too large and too old for joy to fully name. The first formal anniversary of June 19th happened in Houston on June 19th, 1866, exactly 1 year after General Granger's order. Houston, not Galveston, appears to have been the first city to mark the anniversary on the anniversary date itself, as a recent scholarly examination by historian Carl Moneyhon has established. The Houston Tri-Weekly Telegraph, a newspaper whose coverage of the event was distorted by the racism of its editors, who tried to frame the celebration as proof that former enslavers were still the best friends of black people, which, to put it charitably, was a creative interpretation of recent events, reported on a procession through the city streets, followed by a grand barbecue. A procession through the city streets, formerly enslaved people and their children, 1 year out of bondage, walking through the public streets of Houston as a deliberate, organized public act, not because they needed to get somewhere, because walking together in formation through the city where they had been property was itself a statement. We are here. This is our city too. You will see us in these streets, and you will know that we are here, and that we are free, and that we intend to remain so. The walk was the message. The barbecue that followed was not incidental to the celebration. It was central to it, in ways that go deeper than simply needing to feed a crowd. The tradition of communal barbecue in the South, the slow cooking of large cuts of meat over coals in trenches or pits, hours-long, communal, requiring coordination and skilled labor, had roots that ran through West African culinary practices and through the specific history of enslaved people being the primary practitioners of this craft. Enslaved people had cooked barbecue for the enslavers who exploited their skill at it. They had cooked for the plantation celebrations they were forced to prepare but not always invited to enjoy. At the first Juneteenth celebrations, the barbecue was for them. The skill was the same. The fire was the same. The meat was the same. The difference was who the table was set for, and that difference was everything. Long trenches dug in the earth, filled with oak and mesquite coals, grates laid across them. Pork ribs and brisket and chicken and whatever else the community could put together, slow cooked through the afternoon, while people prayed and sang and told stories about June 19th, 1865, already passing it into oral history after a single year, making sure the children would know what had happened. The smoke rose above Houston in columns, and the smell of it carried for blocks, and everyone who smelled it knew what it meant and where it was coming from. And the red drinks. Every account of those early Juneteenth celebrations includes them. Strawberry soda, hibiscus water, red lemonade. Red in every form, served in abundance, treated as almost ceremonially important to the celebration. The connection to West African cultural traditions runs through the significance of red in many of those traditions. Red as a color of power, of vitality, of ancestral presence, of the force of life itself. There is scholarly debate about the precise meaning and the precise lineage of the tradition, as there is with most traditions that survived the deliberate cultural destruction of the Middle Passage and slavery. But what is not debated is the presence and the persistence of the red drink at Juneteenth celebrations from the very beginning, year after year after year. You drink the red drink because something in the body knows what red means. Something older than the celebration, older than Texas, older than the specific date of June 19th, 1865, knows what red means. The prayer services were not separate from the celebration. They were the spine of it. The church communities of Black Texas had developed over generations of bondage, a spiritual vocabulary that was simultaneously profound faith and active resistance. The spirituals that enslaved people sang were not just religious expression. They were coded communication, maps, emotional survival tools, ways of keeping hope alive when hope had no rational basis. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was about heaven, yes. It was also about the Underground Railroad. Go Down Moses was about scripture, yes. It was also about the Union Army. The spiritual tradition had been doing double and triple duty for generations, carrying more meaning per word than almost any other form of human expression. And it brought that same compressed intensity to the Juneteenth celebrations. At those first prayer services, the Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud. Year after year after year, the proclamation read aloud. Not because people didn't know what it said. They knew what it said. Because the reading was a ritual act, a ceremony, a way of saying, collectively, we remember where we came from, and we know why we are here. The oldest people in the congregation, the ones who had been enslaved their whole lives, who had heard the proclamation first as news, and then as denied news, and then finally as enforced news, those people sat in the front pews and listened to it read, and their presence was the whole point. They were the living bridge between what had been and what was. Their bodies held the history that the words were trying to honor. By 1867, celebrations had spread to Austin, organized there under the direction of the Freedmen's Bureau. By 1872, the celebrations had grown large enough and permanent enough that something unprecedented and extraordinary happened. Black leaders in Texas raised $1,000, $1,000, raised entirely within the Black community by people who had been slaves 7 years before and who were now, through wages and careful saving and the mutual aid networks of the church and the community, accumulating something that had been systematically denied them for their entire lives. They raised $1,000 and purchased 10 acres of land in Houston's 3rd Ward. They called it Emancipation Park. 10 acres of land, purchased by formerly enslaved people, less than a decade after they had owned nothing, not their tools, not their clothes, not their children. A park, their park. A piece of Texas ground that belonged to them, deeded in their names, permanent and present, and there every June 19th, waiting for them to come back to it. The man most responsible for this purchase was a Baptist minister named Jack Yates, the Reverend John Henry Yates, who had been born into slavery in Virginia in 1828 and freed in 1865, and had walked into Houston and built a life and a community and a church, and then helped buy 10 acres of ground for his people to celebrate their freedom on. His descendant, Jacqueline Whiting Bostick, described him as a visionary leader who believed the Black community needed their own institutions to be self-supported. He understood that independence required land, and that land required money, and that money required community, and so he built the community first, and the rest followed. The reason they needed to buy their own land for these celebrations tells you something ugly and true about the political geography of Reconstruction Texas. White-controlled city governments throughout the state had begun responding to the growing power and visibility of Juneteenth celebrations the way white-controlled institutions typically respond to the growing power and visibility of Black communities, by restricting it. Many Texas cities had laws, formal or informal, limiting Black access to public parks. The parks that existed were for white residents, which meant that the celebrating community had to create the parks themselves with money that had been recently earned under labor contracts designed to keep them perpetually short of money. They did it anyway. Emancipation Park in Houston, 10 acres purchased in 1872. What is now Booker T. Washington Park in Mexia, 30 acres purchased in 1898 by the local community, becoming the site of the longest-running continuous Juneteenth celebration in the state. Emancipation Park in East Austin, acquired by the Travis County Emancipation Celebration Association in the early 1900s. Land purchased by the 19th of June Association in Limestone County. All across the state, formerly enslaved people and their children were buying ground and calling it free ground, because if the public spaces were closed to them, they would make public spaces of their own, because the celebration was important enough to sacrifice for, because June 19th was worth having a permanent home. The celebrations grew through the late 19th century into something complex and multi-dimensional that the simple phrase Juneteenth celebration doesn't quite capture. These were multi-day gatherings that combined the sacred and the secular in the specific way that Black communal life had always combined them. Because in the Black community, the sacred and the secular had never been as separable as they were in the white mainstream. There were prayer services and political speeches in the same afternoon program. Political speeches, because freedom meant voting, and voting meant organizing. And the Juneteenth celebration was where the community heard speeches from Black politicians and community leaders, where voter registration was conducted, where the work of civic life was done under the same sky and in the same spirit as the worship. There was music, the spirituals and the newer music that Black Texans were creating, the proto-blues and the gospel and the folk songs, and there was dancing, and there were rodeos. The rodeos matter. Black cowboys had been an integral and systematically erased part of the Texas cattle industry from its earliest years. Roughly 1 in 4 working cowboys on the cattle drives of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s was Black. Men who were among the most skilled and most essential workers in the industry, and who received the most dangerous jobs and the least credit. The Juneteenth rodeo was a space to celebrate that expertise, to honor it publicly, to perform it for an audience that understood its full history and full value. When a Black cowboy rode in the Juneteenth rodeo, the crowd watching him wasn't seeing just a show of skill. They were seeing a man who had done that work, who had ridden those trails, who had been essential and invisible simultaneously, now visible, now celebrated, now doing the same work for himself and his community that he had done for others. As the 20th century arrived and brought with it the Great Migration and the particular new forms of oppression that the Jim Crow era perfected, Juneteenth faced pressures it hadn't faced before. The early 20th century was a period of intensifying racial violence in Texas and across the South. The same years that saw Juneteenth celebrations draw tens of thousands of people also saw the lynching of Black Texans, the convict leasing system that turned the state's prison system into a mechanism for extracting free labor from Black men, convicted of minor offenses, the systematic exclusion of Black Texans from political participation through poll taxes and grandfather clauses and white primaries. The celebration persisted through all of it. Year after year after year, people came back to Emancipation Park and Comanche Crossing and the Emancipation grounds across East Texas, and they celebrated. In 1936, the Dallas celebration for the combined occasion of Texas's centennial and the 75th anniversary of emancipation drew somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people. That is the size of a mid-sized American city, gathered in one place for a celebration that most of mainstream America had never heard of. Cab Calloway performed. A 30-minute segment of African American folk music was broadcast nationally on NBC radio. 200,000 people gathered for their Independence Day, and it was still largely invisible to white America. This is how a community holds a tradition that the surrounding culture refuses to see. You hold it anyway. You hold it louder. You hold it larger. You hold it until it's impossible to pretend it isn't there. The mid-20th century brought a different kind of challenge. As the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s gathered force and urgency, Juneteenth began to feel to some in the community like a relic of a past that was being honored while the present demanded immediate action. Freedom Day seemed to belong to a different historical register than the marches in Birmingham and the sit-ins in Greensboro. Some Juneteenth celebrations went dormant. Austin's went on a 25-year hiatus. Some communities stopped gathering on the emancipation grounds that their grandparents had purchased and tended. But Juneteenth was already too deeply embedded in the DNA of Black Texas to die. The tradition had been carried by the Great Migration out of Texas and into every corner of the country. Black Texans who moved to Los Angeles in the 1920s took the celebration with them. Black Texans who moved to Chicago took it with them. Cities that had no direct connection to Galveston or to General Order No. 3 had communities that knew exactly what June 19th meant. And in the 1970s, the celebration began to revive, finding new generations who recognized in it something they needed, something the civil rights movement had not made obsolete: the specific, grounded communal practice of marking the moment freedom was declared and honoring the people it was declared for. In 1979, Texas State Representative Al Edwards, a freshman Democrat from Houston, introduced the bill that would make June 19th an official state holiday in Texas. It was the kind of bill that, in another political climate, might have died in committee. It passed. On January 1st, 1980, Juneteenth became a legal holiday in the state of Texas, the first state in the nation to formalize it. More than a century after the community had first chosen to mark the day, the state finally agreed to catch up to the people, and from there it spread. Through the 1980s and 1990s and into the 2000s, Juneteenth celebrations were growing in every state in the country, recognized by more and more state governments, observed in more and more cities. The holiday traveled the same routes the Great Migration had traveled, nested in the communities that Black Texas had sent out into the world decades before. And in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis brought millions of people into the streets in the largest protest movement in American history, something shifted in the national consciousness about what this day meant and why it mattered that it be recognized officially. Opal Lee, a 93-year-old retired educator from Fort Worth, who had been campaigning for federal recognition of Juneteenth since the 1990s, who had been walking 2.5 miles every year as a symbol of the 2.5 years that freedom had been withheld from Texas, who had gathered 1 million signatures on a petition, suddenly found that the country was ready to listen. On June 17, 2021, President Biden signed the legislation making Juneteenth a federal holiday. Opal Lee was there, 94 years old, in the White House, watching the country officially recognize what her community had been honoring for 155 years. She wore a purple blazer, and she smiled the way people smile when they have been right about something important for a very long time. The original document is in the National Archives. 2 pages of faded handwriting, the ink gone from black to brown over 160 years. Galveston, Texas, June 19, 1865. The order that changed everything, written in a clerk's careful hand, carrying the contradiction that defined it, the declaration of absolute freedom and the instruction to stay put and work for wages, given in the same document, in the same breath. 2 pages that contain both the best the federal government was prepared to do for the people it had spent 2 centuries profiting from, and the hedge around it, and the caveat, and the practical limitation. And also, nested inside those limitations, the crack in the foundation that could not be closed once it was opened. Because here is what General Order Number 3 actually did. Even with all its qualifications, it declared, in writing, with the authority of the United States military behind it, that the connection between enslaver and enslaved had become the connection between employer and hired labor. It declared absolute equality of personal rights. Those words were inadequate in practice. They were revolutionary in law. And the people who heard them, who had been told their entire lives that those 4 words could never, under any circumstances, describe their situation, knew exactly how revolutionary they were. They began testing that revolution immediately. They walked off plantations. They went to the Freedmen's Bureau and asked for teachers. They bought land. They built churches and schools and parks. They showed up to vote when the 15th Amendment gave them that right. And they voted in enormous numbers. And they elected black men to the Texas legislature and to Congress and to local office across the state. The backlash was as severe as the effort. Between 1865 and 1868, the convention that met to discuss Reconstruction in Texas documented 939 murders in the state. 379 of those murders were murders of black people by white people. 379 in 3 years. The violence was not random. It was targeted at the people who were most actively exercising the freedom they had been declared to have. Teachers were killed. Politicians were killed. Community leaders were killed. The Ku Klux Klan operated throughout Texas, burning churches and schools, terrorizing the freedom colonies, making it clear that the right to be free was going to have to be defended at a price that no one should have been required to pay. The dream of Reconstruction, the radical dream of a fully transformed South, with land redistribution and full political equality, and the genuine integration of formerly enslaved people into civic life. That dream lasted 12 years and ended when the federal government made the political calculation that it wasn't worth defending anymore. When Reconstruction ended in 1877 and federal troops withdrew from the South, the freedom that had been declared was still technically on the books. Legally, the 13th Amendment remained in force, the 14th granting citizenship, the 15th granting the vote. But the practical reality was that the machinery of white supremacy had been rebuilding itself for 12 years and was now operating without the interference of federal enforcement. Sharecropping locked black families into perpetual debt. Poll taxes and grandfather clauses and white primaries removed political power. The convict lease system turned the criminal justice system into a pipeline for extracting free labor from black men. Jim Crow laws formalized segregation into every public institution. The distance between legal freedom and actual freedom stretched back out to something that, in its daily texture, in its constraints and its violences and its economic dead ends, looked in too many ways like what had come before. And yet, Juneteenth endured. The celebrations continued. The emancipation grounds were maintained. The barbecue was cooked year after year. The proclamation was read. The The stories were told. The old people sat in the front of the church, and their presence carried the history forward into the children who would carry it forward after them. The community that had built this tradition from nothing in the immediate aftermath of 250 years of bondage continued choosing year after year to celebrate the moment freedom was declared. Not because everything was fine, because everything was not fine, but because the moment of declaration was sacred regardless of what came after, and because the alternative was to let the theft of the years that came after define them, and that was never something Black Texas was going to allow. This is the truth about the very first Juneteenth that matters most. Not the general on the balcony, not the date, not the document, not the 2,000 soldiers sailing into Galveston Bay. The truth is what the people did with the moment once it arrived. They sang, they walked, they found each other on the roads. They built churches the week after, and schools the month after, and parks the decade after. They purchased ground and called it free ground. They made a holiday from a day when freedom was technically declared and mostly still withheld. And they kept that holiday alive through the nadir and through Jim Crow and through the mid-century lull when it seemed like the larger world would never see it. And they kept it until the world had to recognize it. The stubborn, defiant, love-powered persistence of that celebration across 160 years is the real story of Juneteenth. Not the law. The people who kept the law alive in their communities when the law was not keeping them alive. You can let this one settle tonight. You've earned it. We've walked through the salt heat of Galveston in June, through the plantation gates where the news arrived weeks late, down the roads where freedom was being tested one step at a time. We've sat in Reedy Chapel AME as the singing went up. We've watched Jack Yates raise $1,000 and buy 10 acres in Houston's 3rd Ward. We've watched Opal Lee walk 2.5 miles every year until the country finally listened. The woman who walked off the plantation without a word. The man sitting in the middle of the street in Galveston because his knees gave out under the weight of the news. The children who didn't understand exactly what had changed, but ran through the streets anyway because the adults around them were transformed, and transformation is contagious. The old man, who had been enslaved for 60 years and stood in the June heat receiving the news with something too large and too old for joy to fully name. They were here. They built something from the ruins of what had been done to them. They chose to celebrate rather than only to grieve, to honor the moment rather than only the loss, to keep the fire rather than only the anger. They made a table and set it with barbecue and red soda water and the reading of the proclamation, and they invited their children to sit at it, and their children invited their children. And the table got longer and longer until it stretched from Galveston all the way to the White House, where a 94-year-old woman in a purple blazer finally watched the last signature fall. They ran so that you could rest. They built so that you could have somewhere to stand. They celebrated so that you would know what you came from. So whisper something into the June dark before you close your eyes. Whisper it to the heat, to the brine in the air, to whatever part of you holds the history of people who endured and built and loved and refused to be erased. They made something from nothing. They made a holiday from a day of delayed and contested freedom. They made it last until the whole country had to call it what it always was. Good night. Sleep well. And if June 19th comes while you're still carrying tonight with you, eat something red. Think about Galveston. Think about the morning the air changed. Think about 250,000 people waking up, and the long, defiant, golden road they built from that morning to this one.